A 6-mile-long highway, full of charred and dismembered human bodies. There were tens of thousands of people, withdrawing Iraqi soldiers, Palestinian and Kuwait civilians, and children. Thousands of cars were trapped on the highway and pounded for hours by an immense number of American aircraft. It was for sure one of the most heinous war crimes of contemporary history, the indiscriminate and deliberate killing of people who were out of combat. So how did it happen? How on earth could the United States commit this war crime in front of the world in 1991? I mean, it was 45 years after World War II ended, and there ordered were the United Nations, lots of Geneva Conventions that were ratified by all nations in the world, including the United States itself. And the purpose of those conventions was to provide humane treatment for civilians, prisoners of war, and soldiers who were out of combat. Nevertheless, this brutality happened and many people died in a most gruesome way. This story will tell you how the United States, through its ambassador to Baghdad, tricked Saddam Hussein into invading Kuwait, which subsequently led to Operation Desert Storm, then resulted in Iraqi defeat, and finally, that dreadful mass highway carnage. So stick with me.
Saddam's broadcast is a suicide note for the Iraqi army.
Saddam Hussein raped, pillaged, and plundered a tiny nation.
It had been 2 years after the Iran-Iraq war ended, and Iraq was really struggling to recover after almost 8 years of destruction that the war had brought to the country. The war ended with no result, meaning that neither side, Iran nor Iraq, was able to gain any territorial or political advantage at the end of the war. But if it wasn't for the United States, everything would have gone downhill for Iraq. In fact, the US wasn't so friendly with Iraq until the latter had a quarrel with Iran, after the mullahs took over the government in Iran. Considering that at that time Iraq was a Sunni-ruled Shia-majority country, it was very likely that Iran would spread its revolution in Iraq as well. In fear of Iran's religious and ideological expansionism, the United States and its allies started supporting Saddam in his war against Iran. The United States' support for Iraq was very substantial. It ranged from several $billion worth of economic aid, weaponry, dual-use technology to military training. Even during the war, President Ronald Reagan sent his special envoy Donald Rumsfeld, this guy, to meet Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. They talked about Iran and bilateral relations, etc. But the key support was intelligence sharing. In 1988, during the waning days of Iraq's war with Iran, the United States, through satellite imagery, learned that Iran was about to gain a major strategic advantage by exploiting a hole in Iraqi defenses. US intelligence officials conveyed the location of the Iranian troops to Iraq, fully aware that Saddam's military would attack with chemical weapons, including sarin gas, a lethal nerve agent. US officials have long denied acquiescing to Iraqi chemical attacks, insisting that Saddam's government never announced that he was going to use the weapons. But retired Air Force Colonel Rick Frankena, who was a military attaché in Baghdad during the 1988 strikes, paints a different picture. In an interview with Foreign Policy, he told, quote, "The Iraqis never told us they intended to use nerve gas. They didn't have to, we all knew. Those chemical attacks were some of the worst in history, and still the US gave Saddam a hand." This all sums up how close buddies Saddam and the US administration were at that time. Not only the US, apart from some Western countries, its traditional allies like Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and Jordan also loaned Iraq $67 billion to back Saddam against Iran. $14 billion of that $67 billion was loaned by Kuwait, Iraq's extremely wealthy but little neighbor to itself. Saddam was approaching Kuwait as Iraq's king country and questioned its sovereignty many times. Since Kuwait was part of the Basra region under Ottoman rule and much of that region was part of Iraq, Saddam thought he could rightfully claim Kuwait. After the war, Iraq asked Kuwait to forgive its debts with different excuses. Iraq claimed that if it wasn't for them, Iran's revolutionary regime would have already invaded Kuwait. So in return, they wanted the Kuwaitis to forgive their debts. They also accused Kuwait of using an advanced drilling technique to steal steal oil from Iraq's share of Rumelia oil field. But the main reason why Iraq was really pissed off was Kuwait's oil production. Kuwait was far exceeding its OPEC quotas. For those who don't know, OPEC is an intergovernmental organization of 13 countries, and OPEC's main objective is to coordinate and unify petroleum prices among member countries in order to secure fair and stable prices for oil producers. Kuwait was far exceeding its OPEC quotas, and it kept the oil prices low globally, worldwide, which in turn decreased Iraq's oil revenues and made it impossible for them to pay their debts back. To be honest, I can really sympathize with Saddam in this one. I mean, Kuwait had a population of 2 million people at that time, and their oil reserves were more than enough to cover all of their financial needs. Not for a year, not for a decade, but for centuries. Anyway, Kuwait kept overproducing oil and even requested OPEC to increase the country's total oil production ceiling by 50%. Jesus Christ. According to former Iraqi Foreign Minister Tariq Aziz, every $1 drop in the price of a barrel of oil caused $1 billion drop in Iraq's annual revenues, triggering an acute financial crisis in Baghdad. It was estimated that between 1985 and 1989, Iraq lost $14 billion a year due to Kuwait's oil strategy. Anyway, finally Saddam went berserk and deployed 100,000 troops along Iraq's border with Kuwait. Iraq had interpreted Kuwait's refusal to decrease its oil production as an act of aggression and was ready to invade Kuwait. Despite all the financial crisis, Iraq's army was still quite strong and had very large manpower. Besides, due to its recent 8-year-long war with Iran, they were quite prepared in terms of mobility. Not sure about the morale of the soldiers, so considering that they had just started taking a deep breath, and boom, they are dragged into the war. Anyway, the army was ready, Saddam was ready, and the only thing left was to get the opinion of his close buddies before starting the invasion. And who were Saddam's close buddies at that time? Of course, Americans, who had recently helped Saddam to use his chemical weapons to pulverize Iranian troops when Iran was about to win the war. So the first thing Saddam did was to meet with the US ambassador to Baghdad, April Gillespie. But remember one thing, the conversation between the two had been kept secret until a State Department cable published by WikiLeaks revealed it 10 years ago. The general mood of the conversation was very supportive and friendly for Saddam. He made his intentions of invading Kuwait very clear. Ambassador Gillespie told Saddam that she had direct instructions from President Bush to improve their relations with Iraq. Then she went on and very politely asked Saddam why he had gathered that a large number of troops along Iraq's border with Kuwait. Saddam answered that in 2 days they are going to meet with the Kuwaitis. If they fail to settle the dispute, then Iraq will not accept this, implying that Iraq was about to invade Kuwait. Then while answering another question of the ambassador, he said he might defend Iraq's claim on Kuwait to keep the whole of Iraq in the shape he wished it to be. By saying whole Iraq, Saddam meant including Kuwait as part of it. Remember when we talked about that old Ottoman region of Basra? Everyone knew Iraq's claim on Kuwait, it was obvious. Then he asked the US administration's opinion on that. Gillespie answered, quote, "We have no opinion on your Arab-Arab conflicts, such as your dispute with Kuwait. Secretary of State James Baker has directed me to emphasize the instruction first given to Iraq in 1960s that the Kuwait issue is not associated with America." By saying this, she greenlighted the invasion of Kuwait. There would have been no reason for Saddam not to take this assurance at face value. The US was very supportive of his war of aggression against Iran in 1980s. With this green light from the US, it was obvious that the invasion will happen. It wasn't surprising. Anyway, right 8 days after meeting with Ambassador Gillespie, on August 2nd, 1990, Saddam did what he had been doing best for years. He launched an offensive along Iraq's border with Kuwait. It took him only 2 days to completely take over Kuwait and make it Iraq's 19th province. Saddam deposed the Emir of Kuwait and put his own army commander Ali Hassan al-Majid in charge of Kuwait. By the way, his nickname was Chemical Ali, as he was the one who organized all those chemical attacks on Iraqi civilians and Iranian troops. So it was August 1991, Saddam had annexed Kuwait and installed the puppet governor there. Saddam was happy, Chemical Ali was happy, everything was perfectly alright for Saddam. But then things started to get south for him.
Dangerous weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon.
Real madmen of the 20th century.
The British leader implied that the United Nations should consider military action.
Peace and security in the Middle East.
The Iraq annexation of Kuwait was unanimously condemned by all leading countries of the world. Even countries such as the USSR and China placed arms embargoes on Iraq. On August 3, 1991, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 660, which condemned the Iraq invasion of Kuwait and demanded that Iraq withdraw immediately and unconditionally all its forces to the position in which they were on August 1, 1990. Later, they adopted another resolution that set a deadline for Iraq. It authorized all member states to use all necessary means to uphold and implement Resolution 660 if Iraq didn't leave Kuwait until January 15, 1991. It was only the second time since the United Nations was founded in 1945 that member countries voted to use military force. But Saddam, enjoying his 19th province in an old Ottoman region of Basra, probably didn't take it quite seriously and ignored the deadline. By January 15, 1991, 35 countries led by the United States sent a total of approximately 1 million military personnel to Saudi Arabia. And they were positioned there to attack in case Saddam didn't leave until the deadline expired. It was the largest military alliance since World War II. The first Allied offensive to expel Iraqi troops from Kuwait began with an aerial and naval bombardment on January 17, 1991. They dubbed it Operation Desert Storm. This phase continued for 5 weeks and it literally broke the spine of the Iraqi army. During this period, Iraq fired 42 missiles into Israel in an attempt to drag Israel into the war. Saddam thought if Israel joined the war, then other Arab countries would also join the war. But Israel acted carefully and steered clear of the war. Saddam also declared a jihad or a holy war against the coalition in an effort to garner support from Muslim world, but Muslim countries didn't respond either. On February 24, 1991, a massive Allied ground offensive dubbed Operation Desert Storm was launched with troops heading from northeastern Saudi Arabia into Kuwait and southern Iraq. The Iraqi army didn't stand a chance of doing anything against such massive coalition forces. At that time, USSR was still alive and was kind of mediating between the parties. Seeing that defeat is inevitable, on February 25, 1991, Saddam asked for truce through Soviet mediation. And the Baghdad radio also broke into its regular broadcasting at 1:35 a.m. Iraqi time and announced the withdrawal. Quote, "Orders have been issued to our armed forces to withdraw in an organized manner to the positions held prior to August 1, 1990. This is regarded as practical compliance with Resolution 660. President Bush Sr. responded to Saddam's announcement through spokesman Marlene Fitzwater. Quote, "There was no evidence to suggest the Iraqi army is withdrawing. In fact, they are retreating to regroup and fight again. We continue to persecute the war." The next day, Saddam himself announced it personally on the Baghdad radio that Iraqi troops had already begun to withdraw from Kuwait and that the withdrawal would be complete that day. He had also asked Gorbachev to announce it on behalf of him at the UN Security Council session called by the Soviet Union. Saddam was right, so the withdrawal had already begun. But those leaving Kuwait were not only the soldiers. No one knows the exact number, but it's estimated that there were thousands of Palestinian refugees and Kuwaiti civilians who supported Saddam and now had to flee Kuwait. The withdrawal began on a 6-lane highway between Kuwait and Iraq, officially known as Highway 80, but later it would be called the Highway of Death as well. It runs from Kuwait City to the border town of Safwan in Iraq. There were thousands of military and personal vehicles, including lots of buses, trucks carrying thousands of people. United States officials ordered the army to attack the miles-long convoy as soon as possible and prevent them from reaching Iraq. Near the midnight, the first US bombing started. US soldiers were rushing so bad that while leaving the airport, pilots took whatever bombs happened to be close to the flight deck. From cluster bombs to 500-pound bombs. US planes trapped the miles-long convoy by disabling vehicles in the front and at the rear. As a result, they created a miles-long traffic jam on the highway. That's where the Turkish shit began. The pilots pounded the resulting traffic jams for hours. One of the pilots later described it as shooting fish in a barrel. And the pilot said that there were so many jets swarming over the main road that they created their own aerial traffic jam and they feared mid-air collisions. Thousands of Iraqis jumped from their cars and trucks looking for shelter, but it was not possible. The pilots did not even hesitate to use rockets to shoot an individual trying to escape the hell. They continued to drop bombs until all humans were killed. The resulting scene was appalling. There, for 60 miles, every vehicle was bombed, every windshield was shattered, every tank was burned, every truck was riddled with shell fragments. charred and dismembered human bodies were scattered all over the 6 miles long highway of death. I will not show those graphic images in this video, but you can easily find them on the internet. It was an extremely horrendous carnage. No survivors are known and the bodies were never counted. US field commanders tried to portray this one-sided mass carnage as a fighting retreat made necessary by heavy allied military pressure. A televised military brief from Saudi Arabia told that Iraqi forces were not withdrawing, but being pushed from the battlefield. In fact, tens of thousands of Iraqi soldiers around Kuwait had already begun to pull away more than 36 hours before Allied forces reached the capital, Kuwait City. This brutal attack took place after Saddam Hussein announced a complete withdrawal from Kuwait in compliance with UN Resolution 660. Bush Sr. and the US military strategists refused to accept a peace proposal made by Soviet mediation and decided simply to kill as many Iraqis as they possibly could. This kind of massacre of withdrawing Iraqi troops violates the Geneva Convention of 1949, Common Article 3, which outlaws the killing of soldiers who are out of combat or incapable of defending themselves. Also, no attempt was made by US military command to distinguish between military personnel and civilians. Attacks on civilians are specifically prohibited by the Geneva Accords and the 1977 Geneva Conventions. US press accounts tried to make the discovery of burnt and bombed household goods appear as if Iraqi troops were at this late moment looting Kuwait. There were also images of incinerated bodies of Iraqis, which again you can easily find on the internet, but I will not show. Incineration of the human being suggests the use of napalm, phosphorus or other incendiary bombs. As you can see, so many rules of war were violated, so many war crimes were committed, but no one was ever held responsible for these war crimes. No one was ever brought to justice. And the reason why this carnage hasn't been spoken widely is that the Pentagon used pull reporting during the Gulf War to curb the spread of information. It's basically a very effective and organized way to control information flow during military operations or other activities. Videos recorded by independent journalists were banned in America. Nonetheless, after so many years, everything came to light. The aim of this video is not to take sides in the conflict or justify what Saddam did to other countries. Saddam was a dictator obsessed with invading other countries and killing his own people. He was a real old school one. I mean, he was not like today's dictators. In fact, today's dictators would look like Sunday school teachers next to him. The reason this video has been made is to prevent such atrocities from happening in the future. In the end, we are the ones who pay taxes, and our taxes finance our armies. And therefore, I believe as taxpayers, we have the right to demand that our governments use our money for humane purposes, not for massacres. And another reason why this video has been made is that I love storytelling and covering such conflicts, geopolitical stuff, etc. So if you want to see more content like this, please like the video, subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for a new video or videos every week. Take care, see you in the next video. Peace.